Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Tonight's show is brought to you by NatureBox, an online virtual buffet of delicious and healthy snacks that help you satisfy your cravings without all the guilt. Great choices like Cherry Berry Bonanza and a whole lot more. 50% off your first box delivered right to your door. Go to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. That's naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. And thank you so much for supporting the show. By the way, next Tuesday night, on the radio, Dr. Kayla Black will be my special guest as we talk about the psychology of belief, essentially a variation on why do otherwise rational people believe irrational things. This is sort of a theme that comes up from time to time, where we're going to get into the human brain and have a very interesting discussion about how do otherwise intelligent people believe in fairies? How does this happen? We're going to really get into the science of it. So I'm excited about that show. And you will be excited that finally I will have the videos of the speeches and podcast versions of the Unholy Trinity presentations coming up the first week of August. Aaron Raw, Matt Dillahunty, and I sort of did this tour throughout the spring. We may still do some other cities, but I've produced the videos up, or I'm finishing the production of them, and I needed something to release to the radio the first week in August as I'm in Alaska getting hitched. So I don't want to come back, and I'll be back like midday Tuesday, jet-lagged, fried. I will not be in podcast form, my friends. So what I'm going to do is, the speeches run about 30 minutes a piece. They're not really long. And I thought, well, I don't want to do a 30-minute speech once a week for 3 weeks, meaning most of August would just be these short-form pieces. I didn't want to cheat you out of that. So I'm going to do, I think, 1, 2, 3 in a week deal. I think we'll do like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we'll do a different speech every night. So the first week of August, you'll essentially have 3 short-form podcasts. I will include the video version links to those so you can actually see the videos where we have the slides and whatnot. And it's exciting. It was an exciting tour. I just love those guys. They're some of my dearest friends. And the speeches will be coming the first week of August. So be patient with me. They're coming, okay? Did you see the article about Ken Ham saying that we should just pull the plug on NASA? He wrote this column for Answers in Genesis. I'm just digressing. You got to let me vent for a second, but this is just awesome. Ken Ham says, we're wasting valuable time and resources exploring the cosmos in a search for alien life. After all, there are, quote, theological problems with the whole idea of intelligent alien life. I mean, come on, the universe was obviously created just for us. If they do exist, and I'm not making this up, Ken Ham says that the aliens are actually infected by original sin. Adam's sin in the garden has infected the whole universe. So if intelligent aliens exist, they are contaminated with sin. And because salvation through Christ is only available to the descendants of Adam, aliens would not be able to be cleansed of sin and go to heaven. The whole universe will be, and I quote, judged by fire. So since the aliens are just pretty much hosed anyway, it just nixed the whole space program. Why bother? I swear, if I didn't know it wasn't a Poe site, I would think it was like Landover Baptist. Like they were trying to be outrageous just to be outrageous. Just to see, well, I wonder if he'll buy this batshit story, you know? And he's got a totally straight face. We should just stop all of this exploration of space, looking for alien life. Oh, I'm not saying it couldn't exist out there, but even if it does, and if it's intelligent, Adam totally screwed them, and they can't go to heaven with with us, so they'll burn forever. Sucks for you, E.T. I mean, it's just awesome. It's just an awesome story. If you get a chance, just go straight to the Answers in Genesis website and read it, or you can go to Hemant's blog. He wrote a great piece on Ken Ham that it'll make you laugh, then it will make you facepalm. You know, Donald Prothero did a great Skeptic blog article last month about the financial woes of Ken Ham and the Ark Park, you know, the Ark encounter. The article's called Ken Ham's Ark is Going Down, Down, Down. And it's a hysterical article, and it kind of gives you hope that maybe much of this won't come to fruition. Much of this sort of assault on science and reason may not happen. So I certainly hope not. It boggles the mind to see these young children go in there and they just lap this stuff up. And Ken Ham he's positioned as a scientist. Oh, he taught science in educational facilities. He must be legitimate. No, he thinks aliens are going to hell. Whee! Just romper room for the spirit, people. Before we get into the meat of tonight's topic, which is a somber topic, but I mean, forgive me for starting with such levity, but it was just on my mind. Before we get into that, I want to, of course, say a huge thanks out to our sponsor. You know, Natalie and I, today, actually, we're browsing the Nature Box page, and we're filling up. We have an online pantry. You have a pantry online, and you just add stuff to it. It's kind of like being at the video store, right? Hey, does this sound good? No. Does that sound good? That sounds great. Let's do this. You want to do that? Let's do this. Let's do a triple feature, right? And there's kind of sport to it. And that's because NatureBox has got a website that's really easy to use. And it's honestly kind of fun to use. And so our pantry is set for the month of August. When we get back from Alaska, we will have a box full of South Pacific plantains. We're doing the honey nut medley again. They have something called Kung Pao pretzels we're going to try out. Dark cocoa nom noms, sriracha roasted cashews. We also clicked the surprise snack button, so they're going to surprise us with something. We don't know what's coming, but hopefully it will be good. And all of this has 0 trans fats, 0 high fructose corn syrup. There's nothing artificial. They are revolutionizing how we satisfy the snack craving. And you can support this show. Get 50% off, free shipping to anywhere in the USA. Just go to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. That's naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Let me start tonight with an email from Ben. Ben said this: I'm a practicing nurse in an ICU setting with 5 years of nursing experience and 10 years of working directly with patients under my belt. And unfortunately, I've lost count to the amount of people I've seen pass away. The beginning portion of my career was spent under the protective shroud of Christianity, but as my apostasy began in 2011, I began to see death and dying from different perspectives. A lot of my coworkers are Catholics, with a few non-denominational Christians tossed in for variety, and invariably, as someone is close to or has just passed away, somebody mentions they're in heaven now, or God has another angel. I've had to bite my tongue. Death to me has become more final, more important to me than to just dismiss it as a stepping stone to fantasy camp for the delusional. What frustrates me the most is when a patient is not going to make it and we've done many things to them that violated their advance directive due to a family member stepping in and changing the course of action once the patient is no longer coherent, thereby denying any shred of possible dignity in their final moments. Imagine you're the patient. IV fluids bloat your body to an unrecognizable distortion of a person. Blood pressure medications called pressors are administered to keep the heart pumping and the pressure up to some nasty possible side effects, not limited to kidney failure, peripheral vascular necrosis, blood clots, etc. A tube is placed in through your mouth past the trachea to allow a machine to breathe for them, which, as you might well imagine, is very uncomfortable, which usually requires sedation. However, if the blood pressure is too low, we might have to forego sedatives, so you might be very well aware of the discomfort permeating your being. This is God's plan? To have you endure these and other interventions, preventing your peaceful passing away? Now, here's where it gets interesting. Say your heart stops, but the family wants everything to be done. What happens? A flurry of personnel rush into the room, and typically the big guy begins doing chest compressions. For a while in nursing school as an orderly, this was my responsibility. Invariably, while performing these, you'll feel a pop, maybe several. To a person I've spoken to, we all feel a sickening wave of nausea as we realize we're breaking rib after rib in a universally obvious, feeble attempt to revive the already gone. I digress. So as this round of CPR ceases and a lifeless body remains in the bed, waxy expression devoid of life, staring into nothing, the family will then start to pray, or ask the staff to pray with them. I decline and state that this is a family matter as I leave the room to reflect upon everything that's happened. Fast forward a few days, and there's the obituary, quote, "Went home with the Lord peacefully surrounded by family," unquote. I shake my head at the lie. This person died violently, surrounded by strangers, being mutilated by sharp needles and tubes, with broken ribs and soiled linens, with family members thanking God for taking another soul, but cursing the doctors and nurses for letting it happen. If I sound bitter, it's only because I believe that we have a right to die peacefully among loved ones telling stories about you, which does happen, though not frequently enough, as opposed to the method I've just described. Despite evidence that the body is failing, faith is relied upon to bring the person back, and as my career has progressed, I've learned that the evidence never lies. Sincerely, Ben. Ben, thank you for a very candid look at a difficult subject. In this podcast, we explore death, the fear of death, and the question of how we as human beings should approach life, death, suffering, compassion, and dignity. In February of this year, there was an article in the New York Times called "Aid in Dying Movement Takes Hold in Some States." I'll just read a portion of the article before I get to my special guest. It said this: "Helping the terminally ill end their lives, condemned for decades as immoral, is gaining traction. Banned everywhere but Oregon until 2008, it's now legal in 5 states. Its advocates, who have learned to shun the term assisted suicide, believe that as baby boomers watch frail parents suffer, support for what they call the Aid in Dying movement will grow further." In January, a district court in New Mexico authorized doctors to provide lethal prescriptions and declared a constitutional right for a, quote, "competent, terminally ill patient to choose aid in dying," unquote. Last May, the Vermont legislature passed a law permitting it, joining Montana, Oregon, and Washington. This spring, advocates are strongly promoting death with dignity bills in Connecticut and other states. Public support for assisted dying has grown in the past half-century, but depends in part on terminology. In a Gallup poll conducted in May of last year, for example, 70% of respondents agreed that when patients and their families wanted it, doctors should be allowed to end the patient's life by some painless means. In 1948, that share was 37%, and it rose steadily for 4 decades, but has remained roughly stable since the mid-1990s. Yet in the same 2013 poll, only 51% supported allowing doctors to help a dying patient, quote, "commit suicide." About 3,000 patients a year from every state contact the advocacy group Compassion and Choices for advice on legal ways to reduce end-of-life suffering and perhaps hasten their deaths. Giving a fading patient the opportunity for a peaceful and dignified death is not suicide, the group says, which it defines as an act by people with severe depression or other mental problems. But overt assistance to bring on death by whatever name remains illegal in most of the country. Protecting the living, protecting the right to prolong or end living. This is the complex issue we are exploring tonight. My very special guest, Wanda Morris. She's CEO of the organization Dying with Dignity. She's been on the front lines of the Right to Die movement in Canada for many years, educating the public, challenging government officials, and fighting for patients' rights regarding end-of-life choices. And she joins me this evening. Wanda Morris, thank you so much for being on the radio.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Much of this must strike a chord with you. Do you want to talk to me about kind of what you're about and what the organization Dying with Dignity is about?
Absolutely. I was so moved by Ben's email because I think he did such a great job of painting a picture of what end of life is so often like. We know that if people are asked, how would you like to die? 70%, 80% of people say, gee, a home and bed surrounded by my family. And instead, the reality is so often that it's in a hospital with tubes coming out of a body and so often in surgery. At Dying with Dignity, we have a twofold mandate. So one is just to work within our existing laws to help people die as peacefully as possible. And Ben also alluded to the advanced care plan. That's a key piece. And I would really encourage every listener here to make sure that they have an advanced care plan and also to discuss it with their family so that it doesn't get reversed at the end of their life. So we do a lot of work educating about those and also letting Canadians know about their rights as patients and advocating for individuals because sometimes people's rights are not respected. The other side of what we do, the other part of our mission is trying to expand the choices that are available. One way to look at it is that legally, we have the right to stop treatment. So if I'm on blood thinners or I'm hooked up to a life support machine or I need dialysis 3 times a week, I have the right to stop those treatments or refuse to have them in the first place, even if my death will inevitably result. So how come we can say that the person in one hospital bed can say, yes, turn off the pacemaker, withdraw the life support. The person right next door suffering equally as much has no right to have active assistance to die. So our case is that we really believe Canadians that are grievously ill, suffering unbearably, should have the option to have compassionate assistance to end their lives if they so choose.
Wanda, can you talk to me about the advanced care plan? It's been mentioned several times already. I mean, this is a document that says when I reach this stage or if these circumstances happen to me, pull the plug or at least don't extend my life. What is an advanced care plan?
Sure. So an advanced care plan is a document, and they're set in Canada, they're set province by province, the legislation for them, and I believe in the U.S. they're set state by state. Our sister organization, Compassion and Choices, provides free resources on their website. We have free kits that anybody can download on our website, dyingwithdignity.ca. An advanced care plan basically paints the whole planning process. You imagine certain scenarios. For example, if I had severe dementia, if I couldn't feed myself, if I didn't recognize my family, would I still want to be given antibiotics if I had pneumonia? Or at that point, would I want to not have that treatment and just be allowed to die? So that's one example of a scenario. Your advanced care plan documents your wishes under various scenarios. It's not, again, the laws change province to province, state to state. It's not legally binding, but it does carry a lot of moral weight. And one of the biggest things it does is it's a tool that helps you talk to your family about how you want your wishes to be upheld so that hopefully they will respect them. Now, just to be clear, if you are competent and if you can speak for yourself, it doesn't matter what the plan says. No one's going to wave that over your head and say, oh, Mrs. Green, you said that you didn't want life support, so now we're not giving it to you. This is just a document that comes into play if, for example, you've had a stroke and you're in a coma or you've been in a major car accident and for whatever reason you cannot communicate for yourself.
We entertain in our minds sometimes the scenario that what if I was incapacitated and I was lying there and I couldn't speak for myself and I had signed an advanced care document and said, don't give me the feeding tube, don't prolong. But while I'm lying there, I actually have a change of mind and change of heart. What if I really do want to live? What if I still think I've got a shot? I'd be powerless. Do you hear people come at you with those types of scenarios, and how do you address them?
Variations on that sort of a theme, because what we're talking about, whether it's advanced care planning or end-of-life choice, is a conflict between autonomy and paternalism. Who knows what's best for you? And the arguments against end-of-life choice are essentially those that say, people would make bad choices. We have to protect them from themselves. And that is the argument on the one side, and becomes religious when people say, well, God knows best, and, or your priest or someone speaking with God's authority. What we believe is that it's a question of individual autonomy, and what right is more fundamental than the decision about whether we live or die, and who should make that decision other than us. Now, in terms of legislation for choice, it tends to happen at the intersection of autonomy or choice and compassion. So while we certainly believe that individuals should have choice, we believe that the health system should be called into action to help provide that when our compassion is exercised. So when someone is suffering horribly, an individual with ALS who is gradually losing their bodily functions, goes from a walker to a wheelchair to lying immobilized in bed. Seth, you mentioned watching the ceiling, just being completely immobilized. This individual, an individual with ALS, will ultimately stop breathing when their lungs stop functioning, and then will drown in their own lung fluid. So do we say, oh, well, we know best, you should be kept alive? Or at that point, do we say to an individual, no, it's your right, it's your choice, and we will compassionately assist you to die if that is truly what you want?
I had someone talk to me about, and you can speak to this probably better than I can, but they said, if I had a dog who was in terrible pain and suffering and there was no way to cure it and there was no other option, I would take it and spend a few final moments with it and I would put it to sleep and end its misery. In some ways, my dog has more rights than many human beings that are being cared for. Is there any accuracy to that? Is it a huge oversimplification of the matter?
I think for people that truly love their animals, it's a really compelling analogy. And in fact, we would hate to see our animals suffer. So of course, as much as we would want to keep them with us, we would say, it's time for me to stop being selfish. I have to do what's in my dog or my cat's best interest and allow them to be gently put to sleep. The case, I think, is even stronger for humans because nobody else is making it for us. Any state that has legalized assisted dying, end-of-life choice, the person has to be competent and awake at the time. So this isn't something we're doing through an advanced care plan. The individual themselves is repeatedly saying, this is what I want. At Dying with Dignity, we have a program where we work with individuals who are at end of life. They've had the diagnosis of cancer or ALS or Huntington or some other horrific medical future. And so they're saying they want the right to end their lives. And, their families are saying, no, we want you to go. We want the privilege of keeping you here and we'll happily support you. But in the end, what we've seen over and over is that the individual is so determined that they don't want to live without quality of life. And it's because their family truly loves them that they're able to let them go. So
there's some individual choice at play that's integral to the process. I mean, I'm not lying there taking a morphine bath and somebody just unplugs me. Hey, you know what? Seth's taking up air. Let's just go and let's just decide for him. The process is designed under your criteria that I actually get to have a say and even guide the process as I progress in my illness, yes?
Yeah, and what we're talking about is the kind of robust safeguards and guidelines that are in place. The very first one being who's eligible. In the U.S., the eligibility tends to be that you have a terminal illness with 6 months or less to live, but you also have to be, a mentally competent adult, repeatedly and persistently making this request, diagnosed by a doctor and then reviewed by an independent doctor. I think what we saw from the statistics out of Oregon is that over 95% of the people that access assistance to die are registered for palliative care. So you're given a lot of options, but it's you persistently saying, look, at this point, my quality of life is so bad that I would be better off if I was allowed to die.
Talking here with Wanda Morris of Dying with Dignity, somebody in the chat room heard me talk about, what if I was incapacitated and I couldn't change my mind? And they said, put a cell phone in the casket. That's brilliant. I'm going to put that in my will. I want a cell phone down there and a couple of snack bars. We'll just call it good. We have to talk about the slippery slope, Wanda. Come on, the minute you start doing this, before you know it, it becomes easier and easier. The public becomes more and more accepting of assisted suicide. The guidelines become more relaxed. And before you know it, you're just killing people in the name of convenience, aren't you?
It's such a common argument. I think one of the ways that it's been raised, Margaret Somerville, who's a very well-known speaker here in Canada and a very pro-Catholic, she said, in a movie called Trouble with Dying, I guarantee to you, if we legalize euthanasia, your great-great-great-grandchildren will probably die of euthanasia. I guarantee it. So the flawed logic is just one of the things that we see from the religious right. And slippery slope, certainly that same idea, that if one thing happens and something else could, as a possibility, happen down the road, that it inevitably must happen. And it's even more egregiously applied in this case because we're talking about something that is limited by laws and by legislation. I mean, when I think of the slippery slope argument, I'm a mom, and so I think about finding out that my son missed his high school English class. So I just went, oh my God, he missed his English class, so he's going to fail the course, and then he's not going to pass the year. Then he's going to drop out of high school. Then he'll never get a job. So he'll end up in jail, committing a crime, and he'll be killed in jail, and I'll never see my grandchild. Like, that is where slippery slope reasoning takes us. It takes us down the path of hysteria. Or sometimes it takes us to a future that we evolve into. If we could imagine a conversation that somebody would have said about, I can't let you marry a person of your own choosing, look where that will lead. And if we look at how marriage rights have evolved, it was first to choose our own person, then a person outside of our faith or outside of our race, and now to a person same sex. And we can still hear it from the religious right. Next thing people will want to be marrying their dog. So the rhetoric around the slippery slope arguments can sound compelling, but the logic is just fundamentally flawed.
You just said a great phrase, the path to hysteria, which quite often is the path when you're dealing with people living in extremes, speaking in extremes. And it sounds to me like the main opposition in this fight is hard, fast, fundamentalist religion.
I would say that's the main funding in the fight, absolutely. And that the rest of the opposition, a lot of the times when someone is opposed to end-of-life choice and they read the evidence, they change their mind. If they don't change their mind, usually it's because there's some religious element in there. So we know that the Catholic Church, the U.S., are very transparent in displaying who funds what. So, for example, in Massachusetts, there was a bill, there was a ballot initiative to try to bring in assisted dying in that state. And we know that the funding by the Catholic Church and associated organizations like the Knights of Columbus was $3.5 million, and the Compassion and Choices, so the secular group fighting for choice, was, I believe, 1/6 of that or 1/5 of that, so just a fraction. The Catholic Church has a very deep pockets. But what they do is they tend not to, especially in Canada, they don't put themselves on the front line and saying, I'm a priest and I oppose this, or at least not so much. What they tend to do is find doctors or find people with disabilities, and they put them on the front lines. So you have a doctor saying, for example, Dr. Catherine Ferrier from Quebec will say, I'm a doctor and I've seen lots of cases of elder abuse in my practice and I really worry about where this would take me. Well, if you scratch the surface, you find out that Catherine Ferrier is actually a member of a Catholic group called Opus Dei. Dr. Will Johnson is another doctor in Vancouver who's very outspoken about this issue. Well, you find out that he, for many years, was anti-abortion and the pro-life movement. So while people are kind of masquerading, they are legitimate doctors, but they're really hiding their faith agenda behind that. And really, it's all, we know that there are many people, many doctors, many people of faith who support choice, but when they're hiding behind it, it's to try to really to tell an outrageous lie and fool an audience.
So when you're fighting at the legislative level, it's essentially the marketing of fear. Is that the calling card of the arguments against what you're about? They want to kill people. They don't hold life to be as valuable as we do because they may be secular or they don't hold to our religion. And do you find that these are just kind of fear pimps out there trying to get people to make an emotional decision instead of vetting the information you're presenting?
Oh, that's very good. Fear pimps. I think there's really three tactics that I see over and over again. There's the outright lies, like, people are driving from the Netherlands to Germany because they're scared of being euthanized in their beds. Rick Santorum was found by, I think it was Fact Checker, with the lie of the year when he was talking about Dutch euthanasia. So they use lies, the logic flaws, like the slippery slope, and then taking information out of context. Because one of the things about the data is that it can be very nuanced. when we look at organizations or countries, jurisdictions around the world that have legalized choice, they often still have some small element of choice without explicit consent. And so those pieces of data, those data points are pinpointed, and someone says, oh, look, you see, the Netherlands has legalized, and if we look at the data there, we see that euthanasia without consent is out of control. Well, that's such a misleading statement. And if what we see when we look at the data in context is that there are still occasional instances where, a patient is unable to give consent. For example, they're in a deep coma, and the doctor decides that the merciful thing to do is to assist the patient to die. But what we know, and the data so clearly shows it, is that those instances drop dramatically when you have legalization. But that critical piece of context is missing. Instead, what you have is the fearmongers talking about, see, it's out of control, and there's usually some really sort of scary music in the background, and there'll be some statistics, for example, euthanasia in the Netherlands has doubled. Yeah, it went from like 0.2% of deaths to 0.4% of deaths, but you miss that sort of really reasoned and logical context. So then people start to think, well, gee, I know that there's pressure on healthcare budgets, and I know that the population is aging and that there's going to fight for resources, so perhaps I shouldn't support this because who knows where it will lead. And then they've won. They are, to coin another phrase, they're the merchants of doubt. So they just plant a seed that if you allow this to happen, sometime in the future something bad could happen to you.
Do finances ever come into play? Look, it's going to be so expensive to keep him on life support. Maybe we should just pull the plug. It sounds rather cold when I say it like that, but we all know how expensive extended and sustained care can be. Someone's lying in a vegetative state for a period of years, maybe even decades. Does the financial aspect ever play into the decision as to whether or not to pull the plug, or is it all about quality of life?
There's a couple of different aspects to your question. I mean, some people would say, the last thing I would want is for, in Canada we have, of course, universal health care. The last thing I would want is, tax dollars being wasted to keep me alive in a sort of zombie-like state where I'm not getting quality of life. Let me die. But what we know in terms of when people talk about the reasons for pursuing assisted death, they're not financial. They are all about, I want quality of life, I want control of my life, the things that I used to do that used to really bring me enjoyment, I don't get anymore. They are to some extent about not wanting to be a burden on family members. We have individuals that say, I just don't want to keep going. I don't want to keep making my family come journey and visit me every day in this care facility for the next 5 years. I want them to get on with their lives. We can argue about whether or not that's something that we want to promote as a society, but that is a reason that sometimes impacts why people choose to end their lives. But over and over, what they want is quality of dying. When we look at the financial arguments, is there going to be financial pressure? Do we bow to the financial arguments and say people should have choice because it will save finances? In fact, there are no financial savings. Certainly there's financial savings in terms of people having an advanced care plan and documenting their wishes and educating their family members about their wishes. And anyone, no matter what age they are, they can be in a motor vehicle accident. And actually, if you're young, there's much more chance that you would be kept alive in a coma for decades. And that was, of course, the situation with Terry Schiavo, who's an American from Florida that many people would know. So there's certainly a financial argument to say, have your advanced care plan so that if that's not the future that you want, that you don't get it. But in terms of actually being actively involved in assisting someone to die, by the time that you've set up a legal regime with an oversight commission and you've put the protocols in place, there are no cost savings. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, but it's not something you would do to save money.
Wanda, how would you have handled the Terry Schiavo case? I'm doing it from memory, but as I recall, the husband won was it the husband who won the lawsuit to have the feeding tube withdrawn, and she essentially starved to death? She was in a coma or something like that. Is that close?
Yeah. Yeah, it was such a sad case. A fairly young woman, she just went into a coma, I think almost spontaneously. Everyone was getting ready to take out the feeding tubes. Her brain was essentially liquid, the test had showed. And then the parents of Terry were contacted by a religious group and told, there's always a chance for a miracle. And from then, things just went really badly awry. The family started to accuse her husband of just wanting to take her off life support so that her life insurance, wouldn't all be spent on medical care. They said if you loved her, you'd allow the insurance to be used to keep her alive while we prayed for a miracle. And then there was last-minute legislation introduced in Florida that prevented the husband from having his wishes. And of course, one of the lessons for us is that if Terri Schiavo had an advanced care plan, if she had documented her wishes, it would have been over and done with. Her husband contended that they had once watched a movie where someone was in a comatose state, and she had said, if that was ever me, I wouldn't want to be kept alive indefinitely. I'd want to have the plug pulled. But there was no verification of that statement. And so the whole thing was fought out very messily, and eventually the courts gave her husband the right to make the decision, and the plug was pulled.
If I believe what I read in the media, which is infrequently, if I believe what I read in the media, she had some external responses to stimuli. They weren't indicative of brain function, cognitive brain function. It was more like a reflex. But many interpreted that is that she understands us. She can see us. She can't quite tell us she can see us, but this is proof that she is still in the room and she's not in a vegetative state.
It was a really heinous act by the family and the church supporters. What they did is they took hours and hours and hours of video, and they would just randomly call out her name. And, when people are in a coma, often they're not still. They will turn or they will seem to respond, but it's all to random stimuli. But what they did is they had these hours and hours and hours of footage, and then they made brief clips, which they showed in the courtroom to give the appearance of Terri responding to her name. So, no, her brain was liquid. It was looked at repeatedly by doctors for the scans. There was nothing there.
Well, Wanda, what's the move then? I mean, do you pull the tube out and allow her body to starve to death? Or do you administer some sort of a chemical concoction that puts her to sleep and stops her lungs and heart? What's the move? What's the moral thing to do?
We can talk about morally what we might like to do. Certainly, all the jurisdictions in the world require a person to give consent at the time of the chemical concoction being administered, but at least the coma would have ended. Yes, she would have been taken off food and artificial feeding and hydration and allowed to die. I mean, the reality is that many people now, that is how they die. If they we just had a really heartbreaking case here in Canada where a woman by the name of Kim Teskey was diagnosed with Huntington disease. And, we don't have assisted dying anywhere yet in this country. She did not want to see that horrific disease through to the end, and she was getting to the point where she was losing control of her motor skills. So she ended up ending her life by starving herself to death. That, sadly is an option that some people feel is better for their quality of life than just continuing on.
I promised the first call tonight to Josh. Josh is co-admin of the Thinking Atheist Facebook page, and he also helps to moderate the chat room during the show. He calls the program occasionally, and he's become just a friend of me and a friend of the online community. Recently lost his mother, and he was not able to join us last week, but he asked for the opportunity to be able to sort of join me on the radio for a couple minutes tonight. Josh, are you with me, my friend?
Yeah, mate. Can you hear me?
You're on the radio with Wanda Morris. How you doing, my friend? You doing okay?
Yeah, doing all right.
I know that much of what we're talking about strikes a very sensitive nerve with you.
Yeah, it does.
And it's a difficult time. But, talk to me. What did you want to bring to us tonight? What's on your mind?
To be honest, my mind's still sort of all over the place. My mum passed away last week at the age of 68, and we cremated her and stuff last Friday. But she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at the age of 62. And for the last 3 years, she slowly lost her memories of us, the family, her husband, the kids, the grandchildren, her friends, her life. Just talking about this topic of dying with dignity and being able to end your life when you choose with respect is just such a big subject for me at the moment. She was a nurse for 40 years. She cared for people for 40 years. She did ICU, emergency. She was a dialysis nurse. She saw all the spectrums of illness. I know for a fact she was a very proud woman and a very caring person. I know for a fact she would not want to have gone through what she went through the last 3 years at least. You know, she was a shadow of her former self. She was semi-conscious. She couldn't hold a conversation. She didn't even know who was around her. She was her own little world in her mind, if that. She wasn't eating. She basically starved to death. She was in high care. And the thing that did strike home for me is it's not only the patients that have to deal with this, it's the family. It was heartbreaking to watch her go through this. You know, I sat there, we all sat there at the end saying, Mum, just go, just die, stop fighting. You need to let go. She needed to die with dignity. And we made sure she got the best of care, but, you know, you need to go out on your own terms, not just prolong life for the sake of it.
Wanda, you probably see the toll that this experience takes not only on the dying, but on those who are right there in the inner circle, don't you?
Absolutely. And what a compelling story to the families who see it, and especially to the medical staff, the nurses who are often so close to the families and see it over and over again. I think it's absolutely no surprise that we have so many nurses that are among our supporters and donors. And the crazy things that people say, you know, I heard, you know, one family member telling me about, you know, the nurse saying, you know, I don't understand why Jesus hasn't taken her yet. And this craziness about letting life end naturally when it's so much more compassionate if people choose to give them other options. I will also add, because I think one of the things that's really missing in our education as individuals, because we don't talk as a society about death, we just talk about it so rarely, we don't know about our choices, and so often people have choices that could mean the difference between a horrific death and a more gentle one, and they don't know.
Can I just say to Wanda, I actually work in healthcare. I've been an orderly for 23 years at one of the major Australian hospitals. I've worked in emergency for the last 10 years, and I've seen so many people pass away and die. It's just part of the job, and you do get used to it, but when it happens to your own family member, it did help in a way that I understood what was going on, and I could speak to the doctors and the nurses, and they could explain the facts to me. And to a degree, that was a comfort for me because I understood. But still seeing it actually happen and just wanting it to end was the main thing for me.
Josh, I'm so sorry about your mom. And if the chat room is any indication, man, you got a ton of family here that have your back. And if I may say this, and I hope this doesn't come off as cliche, but I'm just hugely thankful that your mom had you. You know, she was surrounded by love. She was surrounded by someone who cared enough.
She had a good turnout for her funeral, and we all spoke, and we had a good wake, and we celebrated her life that day. So she was remembered, and she still is.
It's a conversation that more of us should have, and we should have it more often.
It is.
Josh, my friend, I'm hugging you from all the way here in Oklahoma, USA, all right?
I'll go, and we'll get on with the show, hey?
All right. Take care of yourself, my friend.
See you, mate.
You know, you hear a friend in pain, and it just, you know, hits you right in the gut. And yet, you know, this is part of the human existence. Part of living is approaching dying. And you probably have to deal with the fear of death. Is that part of maybe some of the opposition out here to having these conversations? People are afraid of dying, Wanda?
It's so funny. We actually laugh about this. It's like the Christians with the belief of the afterlife who seem to be the most afraid of dying. I think for a lot of our members and supporters, Woody Allen really summed it up when he said, you know, I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to be there at the time.
I had a message in from Tamara. It's a little long, but let me just read it. It says this: I've been an atheist since I was a teenager. I'm now, many years later, a small animal veterinarian. I actually practice at a cats-only clinic. I deal with death, dying, and dignity, and euthanasia on pretty much a daily basis. I'm often the advocate for my patients who have no voice of their own. Animals, and especially cats, don't tell us when they hurt or are suffering until it's so bad they can't hide it any longer. Many people have a hard time understanding that suffering isn't only pain. It's an entire spectrum of quality of life issues: nausea, starvation, inability to get to the litter box, to be able to get outside in time, etc. It's even harder when I have a client tell me they don't believe in euthanasia, even to relieve horrible suffering because of their religious beliefs or because they want the animal to die a, quote, natural death at home. Just today, I had to explain to a client that dying over a period of several days due to kidney failure is not a death I would wish on my worst enemy, let alone a beloved pet. I have to admit that I sometimes phrase my arguments as, we're doing your God's work, or fulfilling your God's plan, or even just, this is the final blessing we can give them. When dealing with these overtly religious clients, otherwise I phrase my comments more as, euthanasia is the final gift we can give, or we're helping Fluffy find peace, which reflects my own non-belief in the afterlife. How does this tie into the human side of the conversation? Rewind 6 years. I watched my father die from pancreatic cancer, which is one of the more painful, horrible ways to go. Dad opted not to pursue treatment given his particular situation. He had a liver transplant in 2001, and his anti-rejection medication facilitated the development of the pancreatic tumor. He had several months of decent quality of life, which we cherished as a family. Dad became weaker and weaker until he finally collapsed and was into a semi-comatose state a week after Father's Day 2008. Even as unresponsive as he was at the end, you could still tell how much it hurt for us to lift him, bathe him, change his sheets, or give him his injectable pain medications. He was fortunate in that he was in hospice care at home, but the strain on my mom was heart-wrenching. I distinctly remember telling my dad's best friend, himself a human physician, that if my dad were one of my feline patients, we would have euthanized long before he or my mom could have suffered so much. The feeling of absolute helplessness in the face of my father's and my family's suffering was indescribable. And there I was with the ability to give my feline patients relief from suffering, and I could do nothing to help my father. Just thinking about it now brings tears of frustration to my eyes. I spent over a year in grief counseling before, during, and after my father's death. I found peace in my memories of him and my love for him, and I've learned to live with my loss. What I cannot accept is the callous way we treat our fellow humans, that we will give the release of a painless, dignified death to our pets, but not to our parents. I fully support an individual's right to choose the timing and manner of his own death, especially when faced with months or years of debilitating disease. I can only hope that the U.S. follows Canada's lead in passing right to die legislation. Thank you for all you do, Seth. Sincerely, Tamara. Thank you, Tamara, so much for the message. Wanda, did Canada recently pass right to die legislation, and can you speak to what that's all about?
Yeah, we have 3 separate initiatives going on right now. I mean, Canada, the U.S., around the world, this is an issue that is taking off. Our provincial government, our French-speaking province of Quebec, the provincial government there recently passed a bill which will come into effect at the end of 2015, allowing for aid in dying. It's a little bit different than the U.S. model. It's for individuals at end of life, which is not defined with a specific time period, and it allows individuals to receive administered end-of-life assistance, so likely an injection or something through an IV bag. So that's happened. It's happened provincially. It's very interesting because it contradicts the criminal code, which is set federally, so by the federal government, which says that homicide and assisted suicide are criminal offenses. So we really have a conflict between the two. Quebec has said, well, they're not trying to regulate either homicide or assisted suicide. What they're doing is regulating aid in dying, which is fundamentally different. It's about a medical decision between a patient and their doctor. So far, the federal government hasn't challenged Quebec's decision, so we'll see how that plays out and if they do. And there's a whole bunch of interesting politics in behind that between sort of a French-speaking province and quite Anglo-centric federal government in power at the moment. We also have 2 other initiatives that are happening. The highest court in Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada, is going to be hearing a case in October that has been years in the works, and it's a case that, if allowed, will legalize assisted dying, again, for all Canadians. And once again, the provisions are a bit broader than those in the U.S. allowing for an individual not just to have a prescription for lethal medication, but also to have the medication administered. And then the third initiative is a private members bill, and I don't know if you have those in the U.S. These are coming from two private members of our House of Commons who have put forth legislation that, if passed, would legalize assisted dying. So if the court case passes, then what happens is the courts would direct Parliament to write the legislation. If this private members bill passed, then that would sort of be a shortcut straight to Parliament to change the legislation. It's very far down on the order paper, so it's unlikely that anything is going to develop with that legislation. But nevertheless, those are our three current initiatives.
Just this week, I read an article on the BBC Online that Professor Stephen Hawking came out backing the assisted dying bill, which has been going through the processes in the UK. Can you speak to that? Has that been passed? Is it about to be passed?
Yes. So the UK have a different parliamentary system where they have a House of Lords, so the peers in the House of Lords. And one of the peers, a man by the name of Lord Falconer, put forward an assisted dying bill. And it was debated at length, actually just last Friday, in the dialogue in the public leading up to that very public debate. You had many people of note speaking either for or against the bill, including Stephen Hawking and, for example, Richard Branson, and even Lord Carey, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, which is, of course, the head of the Church of England. But Stephen Hawking was one of the individuals who was very powerful in his speaking because he is obviously a member of the disability community, and so he was saying, I've changed my mind, and at one point I didn't support this, now I do. And what we know is increasingly individuals with disabilities are coming forward and saying, don't be paternalistic. We don't need to be protected. We need to have the rights of autonomy just like other citizens do as well. So the House of Lords had an extended debate, and the outcome was that the bill passed into second reading and committee study. So it's still very much a work in process, but moving forward.
Stephen Hawking used some powerful language. He's called it discrimination against the disabled.
And I guess one thing I didn't mention is that the private members bill that's been put forward in Canada in our House of Commons was introduced by two members of Parliament. One is a quadriplegic and the other is a paraplegic. So our two members of Parliament with visible physical disabilities.
Area code 757. Thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio Podcast. Who's this?
Hi, Seth and Wanda. This is Ann. I'm in Williamsburg, Virginia. I wanted to address a somewhat different situation, and that's the emergency occasion. I worked as a waitress at a retirement community, so most of the people who came to the restaurant were very elderly, and we had been given training about how we weren't supposed to resuscitate until we checked to see if they had a DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate order. But one day it happened, and I had worked for the rescue squad for 4 years, and my emergency training just kicked in. I didn't wait for anything. It was Ray. It was my friend Ray, who I knew, and I actually brought him back after his heart had stopped and his breathing had stopped. And he lived for 9 months, basically in torment, and that was something. Obviously, this was like 20 years ago, but I'm still dealing with it because I feel like my adrenaline and my training just kicked in and I didn't even think, and I brought him back. And after about a month, I requested from the management that I get some counseling. And the counselor they assigned me to told me that, well, on that day I was God's angel and God had a plan, all that kind of stuff. So I wonder if Wanda could speak a little bit about that situation. Looking back on it, I don't know what else I could have done. He's in the dining room, he's having lunch, and the people at his table are screaming for help, and I jumped over the buffet and started barking orders to everyone to get him down, and, I assessed the situation and then performed CPR, and by the time the paramedics arrived, he was back. But for the rest of his very short life after that, it was mostly suffering. So that's kind of a different situation, but I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Oh, Anne, the very first thing I want to say is just be gentle with yourself. I mean, you were acting out of compassion, and as you say, the scenario was such that what else would you do? I think one of the things that we can do as a society is if we start talking about death and lifting the taboo, we can talk about other measures. Like, for example, there's medical alert bracelets to let people know if you're allergic to penicillin. Well, why not a medical alert bracelet that says DNR? So we don't put an emergency responder in a situation of having to try to figure out what to do. And of course, every second is critical. You're not going to just leave someone there and go and check a file somewhere to see if there's a DNR order. In Canada, the laws they're very clear. If someone becomes unconscious, the emergency responder, I mean, the default treatment is always choose life. And I think as a society, that should be the default treatment. If there's someone else there at the time, and if they have a properly signed DNR order, then the paramedic knows not to continue. But in the absence of something like that, of course they should continue. So I would just say, please be gentle with yourself. I mean, the fault wasn't in you coming to his rescue. It was in our society that wouldn't allow him a choice to just go on his own terms.
If I might inject here for just a moment, someone in the chat room asked if the tattoo was a solution. Some people have got like some small set of instructions they actually have tattooed onto the skin. I'm guessing those are not legally binding.
You know, there's some really tragic stories about people being resuscitated with, like, DNR written on their chest in black Sharpie, because they're in final stages of cancer. And the legislation varies province by province, state by state, so you'd want to check it out what it is in your own area where you live. But generally, to be binding, a DNR order, do not resuscitate order, has to be on a provincially or state-approved form, and not all provinces have them, and it has to be signed by a doctor.
In my situation, that really wouldn't have helped, because if you're there, you don't rip open the chest and check for tattoos. It's just an immediate kind of adrenaline response. And then I guess it's just the guilt dealing with it afterward. And, I actually saw him later, and he was very sweet, but I could tell he was sort of, hey, look what you did to me.
It's funny, listening to the story from my end, though, when I hear your voice, I just see compassion. There were some who could have turned a blind eye, someone who could have said, screw it, I'm going to make myself invisible, disappear in the other room. And I see somebody who cared about people, and you jumped in and began to do whatever was possible. And I think that's hugely impressive.
Well, thanks, Seth. I know you have a lot of compassion. But, I mean, yeah, of course I've dealt with it intellectually. But emotionally, it's still, I forced him to suffer for 9 months, and that's hard. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a supporter of right to die legislation. So, anyway, thank you for having me.
Can I say something very quickly that's completely a digression, and I hesitate to actually say it in the midst of such an important and somber topic. But you sound, to me, just like Marlene Sanders, who's the narrator on HBO's documentary series. And when I hear your voice, I feel like I'm listening to that national level narrator, documentary. I want to get your autograph or something. I just got this flash when I was listening to you speak. So you probably never heard that.
I have emailed you in the past, and you told me I had a good voice.
I want to encourage the audience, just Google or YouTube Marlene Sanders HBO documentary, and then compare the two voices and tell me, do you ever see these two at the same place at the same time? Because it's possible. Yeah, you're precious. Thank you so much for calling the show tonight. Okay?
Anyway, thanks for the laugh.
All right, take care of yourself.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye. I've got 972 on the switchboard. Thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Elijah.
Elijah, what's going on?
I like the show so far, and I digress a little bit because I know that America has the death penalty, but is having a problem allowing choose to die laws. Sorry, my English is a bit rusty. And the second topic I'd like to talk about, which is pretty important here in Israel, is organ donation, because religiously it's like bad for the body to go with missing organs. I'm sorry.
You're doing fine, Elijah.
Distracted by the chat.
I'm guessing Wanda may want to speak to this. I know I've got an opinion, but you're my guest, Wanda, and it's your floor. So what do you think?
We don't actually have an opinion on organ donations. We just really stay silent on that. We don't ever want to get to the place where people think that they're going to be assisted to die for the purpose of having their organs harvested.
Oh, yeah, a harvesting of the organs, like the Michael Crichton book and film Coma comes to mind. Yeah, I hadn't even considered that there would be fears about that, more ammunition for the merchants of doubt. As far as the death penalty, whether you agree with it or not, I think it's a different circumstance. You're talking about people who are, quote unquote, being punished for a specific act or crime or a breach of the law. And that is not something that they do to themselves, but is carried out by the state. So I think it's apples and oranges there. That's probably another conversation.
It is. Well, it's so interesting because many of the supporters of the death penalty are from the Christian right. So what an anomaly that people are willing to inflict death on others when they're not wanting it, but refuse to provide a gentle death when people are begging for it.
It's very Old Testament. It's very eye for an eye. If you kill somebody, we'll kill you back. That's kind of how it goes. Elijah, thanks for the call, my friend. Area code 248, you're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Joanne. I wanted to weigh in because I've buried two siblings, and I was at both of their deaths. And I actually, after Barbara died, I want to write like a TED Talk or something, and it needs to be titled The Dirty Little Secret of Hospice, because hospice tells you that your loved one who's dying of cancer is going to slip into a coma, and then they're not going to come out of that, and that is a lie. They give you enough morphine to kill a horse, but your loved one is not going to slip into a coma. You have to put them into a coma. And because we didn't read between the lines, we had to witness Barbara dying of kidney failure. And it took a long time, and it was horrible, and it was messy, and it didn't smell good. And you wouldn't let your dog die like that. And she was the most religious person that you'd want to meet. I'm an atheist. But the last coherent words out of Barbara's mouth were, "Shoot me." She didn't want to die like that. She didn't want her mother to see her die like that. And she had cancer for 2 years, so we were prepared to lose Barbara. We were traumatized by her death, and we always will be, because we didn't read between the lines and give her a little more frickin' morphine.
You're not making a blanket statement about all hospice care in this situation, are you?
Well, they know what kidney failure is like. They know it's not a gentle, easy way to go, and they told us that, and that's a lie. They told us she would slip into a coma. They knew she wouldn't slip into a coma. So it could be a blanket statement. Now, when Johnny died, we may have morphined him to death. I hope we did, if we prevented something like what happened with Barbara. I don't know. We'll never know. And it doesn't matter, because he was dying of cancer anyway. He was on his deathbed, same with Barbara. She was not going to get up and walk away from this. She knew it. We knew it. Everybody knew it.
What you're talking about, Joanne, is the horrific situation that we put people in at end of life when they're suffering is because essentially we're making them wait for a fatal complication. They want to die. Their body is starting to shut down, and oftentimes with really horrific side effects like nausea, breathlessness, itchiness.
Right.
And they're just waiting for that one thing to happen. And because our criminal code, because our legal provisions are such that if a doctor actively assists someone to die, in Canada, they can face up to 14 years in prison. So there are very
And we
often,
could have faced murder charges if
yes,
we had knowingly given her too much morphine. That's ridiculous.
There's very often...
What would we have done it the day before or 2 days before? Really?
Yeah. There's very often a covert conversation that goes on between doctor and family to say, for example, if your family member is in pain, just press this button. If they're still in pain, just press the button a little bit more. But they're not telling you,
They can't. It's the dirty little secret. It's the dirty little secret. They can't say it because of the laws. And I'm here in Michigan where we had Jack Kevorkian, so there's some really strict laws in place here now to prevent just that exact sort of thing. And now most of my family is at least a little bit religious. And after Barbara was gone, my mother, who was there, who was traumatized, and who, by the way, has the same kind of cancer. And she said, oh my God, I think, Kevorkian may have not had such a bad idea after all. This was horrifying to watch.
Joanne, thank you for the perspective and for the call. That sort of segues me into a question I have for Wanda about Dr. Kevorkian. Did we answer your question or speak to the topic?
Well, yeah, it's basically the answer is there is no answer unless something changes. And I would love to actively do something to change it, but I don't know what to do.
Let me just jump in on that one first. In Canada, I really encourage people to get in touch with us at Dying with Dignity, our website, dyingwithdignity.ca. We've got a great Facebook page and a Twitter, DWD Canada. In the U.S., the organization that's the primary one is Compassion and Choices, and you could get in touch with them. Anywhere else in the world, there's a website called the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. Check that out and find the organization that is in your country. We are looking for resources of time and money, and you can help.
Thank you so much for the call. I appreciate you, Joanne.
Thanks.
All right, take care. Wanda, what's your take on Dr. Kevorkian? When I was in the faith, they called him Dr. Death. Everybody called him Dr. Death, and he was sort of this bigger-than-life guy who liked to kill people or help them kill themselves. They painted him with this brush of caricature, and it's funny, as I'm looking at Dr. Kevorkian now through the looking glass the other way, outside of that religious sort of a filter, I, in some ways, kind of admire the guy. I don't know. What's your take on Kevorkian?
I would say that my feelings are mixed. On the one hand, here was a man that was motivated by compassion, that had seen some pretty horrific deaths and wanted to do something to bring about a change. But on the other, he was a renegade who was acting on his own initiative without controls in place. So I think the remedy that he offered, a kind of a do-it-yourself, fix-it situation, was not the right way to go. Now what we see people of courage working to perhaps be a test case and do that once publicly and then allow themselves. There's a doctor in Australia, Dr. Rodney Syme, who's come forward as an individual that's done a test case of assisting someone to die and allowing that to go public, so doing the act, but with the ultimate objective of bringing it into the public domain where it can be regulated. Two things about Dr. Kevorkian. One is that his criteria was unclear. It wasn't just individuals that were, say, terminally ill or suffering unbearably. And secondly, there was not the robust regime of safeguards that a thinking person would want. Nobody is saying that there should be assisted dying on demand. We want to make sure that we test for capacity, that there isn't mental illness, that the person is really grievously ill. And I think Joanne's comment about Michigan is very telling. In fact, Dr. Kevorkian set the movement back there because by acting as just on his own initiative and as a loose cannon, essentially, people got really scared and thought that's what assisted dying would be like. So while I appreciate what motivated him in one place, on the other hand, I think that Michigan will suffer because of the way he acted.
Well, that segues into one of the other arguments we hear. Why a physician? Why have a doctor do it? Why taint the medical profession is quite often how I hear it presented in more conservative circles. Why have a healer bring about someone's death? Shouldn't it be someone else? What's your take?
Well, a couple of things. And first of all, the doctor, especially when we're talking about U.S. legislation, the doctor is providing medication. So they're not administering it. It's the individual that's bringing about their own death. And, a doctor right now could actively remove somebody from life support. So why is that a distinction? I think there's clearly got to be a role for doctors in the process in two ways. One, because the doctors are the ones who do the diagnosis. Is this really terminal cancer? Is this a stomach ache? And also, doctors are trained, and every day they exercise skill in discerning competence. For an individual to make a medical decision, whether it's refusing or withdrawing treatment or asking for assistance to die, they have to be competent. They have to understand the nature of what's being proposed and the consequences and agree to it. And so doctors are ideally placed to assess if an individual is asking for assistance to die. Are they competent to make that decision? Beyond that, now, the doctors are also the gatekeepers for the prescriptions. So, if you want to change the legislation and allow nurses to give those prescriptions, I think there could be an argument for that. In Canada, where we're looking at not just prescribing medication, but actually administering it in some cases, at Dying with Dignity, we're very open to the idea that the prescription could be administered by, a nurse or another healthcare professional under the supervision of a doctor.
Wanda, you want to put an exclamation point on this conversation for me? So anything that you would like to leave our listeners with, and one last sort of brushing over of all those websites you tossed out? I want to make sure to give everybody those resources.
I would just say to this community that The onus is on us as humanists, as skeptics, as atheists to rebut the nonsense that is put out there so often by religious bodies and often hidden behind false evidence and lies and misleading logic. This is a time when we need to be informed and to get out there and to speak truth and to combat the misstatements that are there. I would love listeners, followers, supporters from all over the globe. Our website is dyingwithdignity.ca, our Facebook page, Dying with Dignity Canada, our Twitter feed at DWD Canada. Love to have you on, love to interact with you, and wish the U.S. and everywhere else in the world lots of luck. I feel that we're at a tipping point. We're getting really close, and we just need to keep putting reason out there and combating the lies. And pretty soon, people won't have to suffer horribly at end of life any longer.
I will include links to all of those in the description box. Thanks for speaking so candidly about a difficult subject and sort of making it something I think we can all sort of relax around. I mean, if we take the stigma away from the subject of death and talk about it like real people, I think that's a huge step toward finding solutions.
It is, for sure.
Wanda Morris, thank you so much for being a part of tonight's show, and I will direct as many people as possible to your website tonight, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Seth, and thank you to the whole community.
Next Tuesday night, we're going to talk about the psychology of belief. How does the brain go there? And how do we combat that in ourselves and in others? We'll talk about that with Dr. Kayla Black and others. Tonight's show sponsor, NatureBox, offering 50% off your first order, free shipping anywhere in the States. Log on tonight, check it out, naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. That's naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. And I'll see you later.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.